Welcome to the Atheist and Christian Book Club. My name is James Walker. I'm one of the two co-founders of the book club. I'm kind of the Christian side of that. I'm a Christian apologist, work for Watchman Fellowship, a Christian ministry focusing on largely interfaith evangelism and defending the Christian faith. I'll introduce in just a few moments our other co-founder, Bill Cluck, former Christian, now atheist. And what our club is, and we've been going out about 5 years now, more than 5 years. We are a monthly gathering of believers and skeptics, respectfully discussing important books from both perspectives. We generally alternate. We'll do a Christian book one month and an atheist book the next month, and we will have conversations about that via Zoom, sometimes in person as well. And first of all, our guest author. I'm very excited to have a member of our book club. We've had 5 or 6 over the years. Our book club members are also authors themselves, and this is one case. Eric Hernandez, longtime member of the Atheist and Christian Book Club. Eric is the Apologetics lead and millennial specialist for the Baptist General Convention of Texas, and he is the author of the book that we're going to be discussing this evening, The Lazy Approach to Evangelism. Eric, welcome. Well, back, you're a member of the club, but welcome back now as our guest author of the Atheist and Christian Book Club.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here with you guys.
I have some questions lined up for you, but I did want to give our first shot to our other co-founder, Bill Cluck. Bill Cluck is a former Christian, now atheist. He and I started the book club back about 6 years ago. And so, Bill, you have a question to get started with Eric?
Here's the thing that's really something. We have 3 former Christians that I know of: Ken Daniels, Double G, and me. All 3 former Christians. So you got your hands full, Eric. By the way, Eric was extremely nice to me. I met him at Texas Baptist, their offices, and he introduced me to everybody. And I really appreciate that, Eric, your hospitality and, so forth. But we have a really special guest. Godless Granny, Double G, is here in the house. So I first saw her videos and I went, this girl is so insightful, just so brilliant, so, well informed, that I just was like, oh my gosh, I got to get her on our club. But anyway, so I'm going to let Double G do the first questions, because we got a lawyer who is brilliant. Why should I? She must increase, I must decrease.
Well, thank you, Bill. You are too kind, and I appreciate the opportunity of being able to ask the first question. And so my question is kind of lengthy, so I'll get right to it. But thank you very much, everyone, for allowing me this time. In chapter 14 of your book, Eric, you discuss attacking the logical coherence of a chain. My biggest problem with the Christian God follows a similar chain, although not exactly as you describe in the book. And it's the problem of divine hiddenness. The Christian God claims to be omnipotent, omniscient, benevolent, and claims to want all people to know him and believe him, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Except for the Calvinists, of course, who say that God only wants the elect. And I realize that you, Eric, are not a Calvinist, and so we'll just leave that particular opinion to the side. And yet, this is clearly what we this is clearly not what we see happening in the world. As fewer than 1/3 of the world's population identify themselves as Christian. And Eric, I know that of that 1/3, you would say that many in that group are not actually Christians, making the percentage much lower. So if God wants everyone to know him and has the ability to accomplish that goal, why doesn't he? Either God can or God cannot accomplish that goal. There are no other options. If he cannot, then he isn't who he claims to be. He isn't omnipotent. If he can but won't, then he again isn't who he claims to be, as he claims to want everyone to know him but chooses not to accomplish that desired goal. Further, since the result of not acting on that goal is the eternal destruction of the vast majority of humanity, not accomplishing that desire violates his claimed benevolent nature as well, and thus I find the claims incoherent. No matter which way you turn, God cannot be who you claim him to be. If your response is free will, Jesus allegedly appeared to Paul and told him what he needed to know in order to believe. If that was not a violation of Paul's free will, why is it a violation of free will for him to do the same thing for other people?
So good question. Lots to unpack there. So as a preliminary remark, I'd say I don't know what the percentage would be because while I wouldn't mind saying that the percentages that are reported, some might not be Christian. I will also say that there is a large percentage that is unreported. If you look at likely the largest church in the world is the underground church in China, where there's extreme persecution. So there really wouldn't be an accurate way to even get the percentages there because they're not going to report and tell on themselves and risk getting thrown into jail or be killed. So I don't know what the percentage is. I think here a few things. There seems to be, in other words, let's make the distinction between what God, if the argument is, or if rather you assume that on the Christian view, it is God will make everyone believe in him, yet not everyone believes in him, therefore this God doesn't exist, or however you articulated it. I would say, well, that would be a false presupposition about the Christian worldview. The Christian worldview is not that God will make everyone believe and follow him. So there is no contradiction to say that God desires that everyone know him and the fact that not everyone knows him. So there's no contradiction there in that aspect. There have been lots of responses to the divine hiddenness problem. And without going through all 14 different types of responses, in a debate I did with Justin Schieber, he brought this up as well. And I think, to be fair, I think it's one of the best arguments that a non-believer could present. I don't think it works, but I think it's one of the best. So just to throw out a few, one would be that, I guess a simple one would be that there are no what Schellenberg calls non-resistant non-believers. So this was an argument made popular by Schellenberg, and he basically says if God exists, there will be no non-resistant non-believers. There are non-resistant non-believers, therefore God doesn't exist. So one response is there are no non-resistant non-believers, but I don't mind saying that there are non-resistant non-believers. And here's one reason why is because I'm a resistant believer. And if I as a believer resist God, then it's no stretch of the imagination to assume that even non-believers will resist God if even I as a believer resist God. On top of that, it assumes that God wouldn't want to hide or God wouldn't hide to begin with. Yet we see in Scripture that Isaiah says, truly your God who hides himself. Jesus hid his messianic identity from people, and it literally says so that they wouldn't turn and believe. That's a whole theological discussion in itself, but the point is, I do say this in the book as well, maybe even around one of those chapters that you just mentioned, is I find it odd when objections are put forth saying, if Christianity is true, we shouldn't expect this. And yet the very thing some are claiming that we shouldn't expect are the very thing that Scripture predicts, that God will hide, that God does hide, that God has hidden. So I don't see how an argument being consistent with what Christianity predicts could in any sense be used as an objection against it. It can also be the case, it's also the case rather, that God doesn't just want people to believe him. So if God were to write his name in the sky or just show up, sure, people may believe in him, but that's not what he desires. And there's also an argument to be made out now, and with this, and if you want to follow up, I'd be happy to take that. That if I would argue, to just be brief, that the more revelation one gets, the more knowledge and revelation one gets, the more responsibility they incur upon themselves. And the more revelation and responsibility they reject, the greater their punishment in the afterlife. So I think it almost ironically, if you will, becomes, even though it sounds counterintuitive, it becomes a sign of God's grace and mercy for him to hide from people who, though they may believe him if he revealed himself, wouldn't follow him, because he's only adding to their condemnation. So it could also be the case that God is intentionally hiding, and is hiding because that person either will not follow him, though they will believe in him, because Scripture says, demons believe and tremble. So it's not just he wants people to believe in him, but follow him. And if he knows they won't, then it's a sign of God's grace and mercy to hide in the first place.
Granny, did you have a follow-up question?
I do, but I'd like to let other people have an opportunity if someone else would like to first.
Oh, Eric, I had something quick. The empty tomb, you talked about the minimal facts that Kerry Habermas has outlined. the empty tomb used to be a minimum fact, but it's been downgraded. He doesn't use it as a minimum fact anymore. Did you know that?
So in his book, actually, the one he co-authored with Lincona, he called it a +1 fact. In my book, I say that I'm going to give a variation, and then there's a footnote by the empty tomb. So the empty tomb is a +1 fact, not considered a minimal fact because, and it's footnote 175, I think. Yeah, so he used it as a +1. It doesn't meet a certain threshold. So I have a footnote in that in my book, and that's why I qualify by saying I'm giving a variation of it. And the way I word it is that it's a large majority of scholars. In that book with Lincona, he says it's 75%, but in a recent interview he did, he said that number has jumped up to 80%. So it may eventually become a minimal fact, but even in the book, I have a footnote noting that it doesn't meet the threshold of what he would consider minimal fact, but I still use it and let the reader know in the footnote there that he considers it a +1 fact.
Eric, have you seen Lydia
Go ahead.
Have you seen Lydia McGrew's criticism of how Gary Habermas counted the scholars?
It's been a while and I haven't read anything in depth on that.
She wrote a very recent blog post in which she was quite critical of Habermas, and she says, an important place where problems can arise in the minimal facts arguments is Habermas's own interpretation of scholarly writings and his statistical calculations. Many, including myself in the past, are inclined to take his word for it, that he interpreted what he read correctly and found that X% of scholars think Y. But as I've begun chasing down his footnotes and reading the scholars he attributes to him, the problem has become so severe that at this point I literally do not think that Habermas's summary of what a scholar thinks has much value at all. And even when he gives a short quotation, I want to chase these down to the context. It's not that I think he's being deliberately deceptive. It's just that he's unfortunately not doing a good job of interpretation at all.
They've had their differences, but I'll simply say this. So at best, you can say, without having read that, you can say, okay, so they're not a consensus and Habermas miscounted. Still doesn't discount the fact. In other words, all one would lose at best would be, okay, you can't call this a minimal fact in the way Habermas defines it, but you still stick to the evidence and look at the historicity for each fact that I present, Habermas presents, that McGrew would present, that anyone would present. Take away the label minimal fact, and then the argument would still stand as to whether or not it's historically reliable and it's evidence for the case for the resurrection.
Kelly, I have just recently finished reading Gary's new 1,000-page book he just came out with, and I interviewed him. We talked for about an hour and a half, and he's extensively thorough, and he's had a lot of charitable back and forth with the McGrews and other people that are critical of his methods. And I can tell you plainly that he has extensively footnoted and referenced everything he cites in his book and is careful to do his best to represent what the scholars he shows are saying. And he gives an outline of how history is done, the credentials of the people that he is featuring. Most of them are New Testament historians in their field, and a majority of them do not accept the resurrection. And all Gary is doing is collectively, he's noticed a pattern over the years of his scholarship that a lot of these New Testament scholars who don't hold to the resurrection literally are nevertheless affirming certain historical facts about the New Testament or the reliability of the history of the New Testament. So he's definitely not saying, he's definitely open to his critics, and he's definitely thorough in this last book about responding to those. But the gist of his minimal facts, and he told me this personally, is just seeing a pattern in the liberal scholarship that affirms the viability and reliability of the New Testament in general, despite their rejection of the resurrection. So he's very open to his critics and listens to them, includes them in his conversations and thoughts, and is not a closed-minded guy in his academic tower, not listening to anybody. He's wide open to what his critics are saying.
So, Dan, is that why he didn't interview Bart Ehrman, who he quotes extensively in the book?
He told me in the book, he said he would he would love to talk to Bart. He even said in our interview, if Bart was his neighbor, he'd probably love to hang out with him. So I don't know if it's time or just schedule or whatever the case may be, but Gary's very willing to talk to him. So far as what I learned from talking to Gary and reading the book. So all that to say, he's open to the criticism, and he's had a lot over the years. So he's not closed off to what Lydia or anybody is saying in response to his facts argument.
But let me bring up another point in the book. He used the C.S. Lewis trilemma, Lord, lunatic, liar. And I think you mentioned that, there's legend is the best explanation by far. I mean, and the reason we believe legend is the best explanation, obviously birth narratives are fiction. The trial is full of fictional elements. Even the great Dale Allison said the post-mortem appearances are legendary. So, and the miracles, we can throw them out. So do you understand, Eric, what's left is very little we can know about Jesus.
So I would disagree. And in the book, before that section on the C.S. Lewis's trilemma, I deal with mythicism. So in other words, I address it before I get into the trilemma. So I don't include legend as an L in the trilemma.
Did you, Eric, could you just give a couple of talking points on the mythicism? I don't think most of the atheists that are part of our book club fall in that category. But there are, I think, some that would
I think there was
say they're still undecided. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Ken.
Understanding there. I don't think Bill was advocating mythicism. He was talking about legendary elements in the narrative itself. Bill fully accepts Jesus' existence, so I don't think we need to spend time on this. We spent a lot of time on this in past book clubs. I don't think most of us subscribe to mythicism, that are those of us who are non-believers.
Yeah. Do you want me to touch on that or?
Well, that's okay. It's the Bill did talk about adding legend to liar, lunatic, and Lord, the trilemma, but I know Bill's not a mythicist, and most of our book club members aren't. So maybe it would be better to circle back around and talk about some of the legend, what Bill calls the legendary embellishments to the gospel narrative.
Yeah, I mean, I see early on you have Mark likely being the earliest gospel, and you have highest Christology early on. I guess it would be a case-by-case basis with the legend aspect. And I know Bill's not a mythicist. There are at least two different types of mythicists. Those that say Jesus didn't exist, and then some that say, well, he did, but there were embellishments, and the Jesus, quote unquote, we have today, or that Christians believe in today, did not exist, and things of that nature. But yeah, I see the early evidence, especially something like 1 Corinthians 15, where you have within 2 to 3 years of the crucifixion, you have a very early creed that dates back and talks about aspects of Jesus that would really be a core aspect of the gospel. And again, everything else would have to be a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, it's interesting that even Bill, and he might want to talk a little bit about this as well, but he would say some of the alleged contradictions in the gospel accounts he argues that may be a better argument for the fact that there's an underlying historical reality there, because when you make up the story, all the elements fit, and the very fact that there's different versions, different variations in how the witnesses talk about the elements, that those actually might point to authenticity rather than making up the fact. Bill, did you want to address
Oh, absolutely.
that?
Yeah. That adds credibility and, to the story. And I believe, like in Mark 6, where they go, hey, he couldn't really do any great healing. Well, that sounds credible. And his family's going, we need to get this guy out of here. The Syrophoenician woman, where she says, Jesus, can you heal me? And he goes, why should I give the children's pearls to the swine? And she goes, even the dog, or to the dogs. And he goes, even the dogs get the crumbs. So that portrays Jesus as a jerk. So I think that's totally historical. And it shows his misogyny. It shows his, how he's xenophobic. Yeah, that's the real Jesus right there. Yeah, there are some real historical things there in the Gospels, but still we have so much Christian tradition, Christian interpretation, layers upon layers, that it's going to be really difficult to get to the real Jesus.
So you're telling me there were embellishments, or there's possible embellishments, but they left in the alleged misogyny and xenophobia.
Absolutely.
But they threw in the embellishment.
Yeah.
So they were able to add in stuff, but weren't smart enough to take out stuff.
Yes.
Okay.
Am I making a fallacy? Logical.
I
was looking forward to hearing from our faithiest atheist. I think he had said he had a question. I don't have one queued up for myself.
Okay. Richard,
and
did
he's
you have
also
a question?
He's also a former Christian atheist, turned atheist.
Yes. Yeah, Richard was our guest. What was that, 2 or 3 months ago, Richard?
Yeah, a few months ago.
Yes. And so the faithiest atheist is back with us. Welcome back. And did you have a question for Eric?
Yes, and a very quick question, and maybe we'll take it in a different direction. Eric, if you were to become an atheist, God forbid, would you still keep hanging out with Christians? Would you go after Christians? Would you try to talk them out of it? What kind of atheist would you be?
That's a really good question. I don't know, because I'd have to put myself in a mindset that I think is, how can I say this gently or nicely? In a mindset that I don't think makes rational sense. I don't think has a logical basis to stand on for various reasons. So it's almost like I would have to deny reality to be an atheist. So I would have to put myself in a mindset where I'm already denying some things that I would say are either self-evidently true or have so much evidence behind them. So what would get me to that mindset, and what kind of mindset would be a result or byproduct of that, I'm not sure. But so since I can't answer that, I would say that yes, of course, I would still hang out with Christians, just like I currently hang out with atheists. You know, you and I would consider one of my very good friends. And yeah, whether you become a Christian or not, you know, we'll be bros for life, or cousins for life, I guess. Maybe not brothers for life, but yeah, absolutely, I would still hang out with Christians. I mean, I hang out with Mormons, people who disagree with me. And now, if another aspect to that is that I do what I do because I stand for what is true, and I think there are eternal consequences to that. However, if I were to be convinced there is no God, then I guess part of me, and again, I'm speculating here, but part of me wouldn't see the point in trying to convince Christians there is no God, because now I'm wasting part of my limited one shot, if you will, of a life arguing with people that at the end of the day, it wouldn't matter. At the end of the day, we're all, you know, Moreland talks about, similar to what Craig talks about, the absurdity of life without God. Like, if there is no God, you know, then we're just playing Monopoly. And at the end of the day, it goes back into the box and goes under the bed. No one takes any prizes home. You know, whether you got in jail or got out of jail or won and took the bank, it doesn't matter in the long run, objectively. So to me, it's like, why would I waste the time that I do have existing, talking to people and trying to convince them of something that in the end doesn't matter? Now, I think what I probably would do would maybe just focus more on maybe social issues or political issues, but I don't necessarily see that as the best thing. In my book, I talk about postmodernism and how when that permeates a culture, what tends to happen is morality is replaced with politics. Because if there is no objective right or wrong, then there is no, you can't say someone is right or wrong. At best, you could say they're politically correct or politically incorrect. And I'm not saying atheists believe that, and it's a whole other discussion as to whether or not that's most logically consistent. But I would say, given that you're asking me, yeah, I wouldn't see the point in trying to argue with someone over that. In fact, it would be one of the last things I'd want to talk about. Just like I don't try to convince someone that Taco Bell's the best food around. I think it is. But I don't see the point in trying to convince someone, because at the end of the day, I'm still going to eat it whether you eat it or not. So yeah, I would see it as a waste of time.
Go ahead, Double G.
Yeah, and that is, if Christianity were untrue, would that not then mean that all of the time, energy, and money that is spent on trying to proselytize, on trying to spread the faith, would be a complete waste of time and energy. And if Christianity were untrue, would it not be in everyone's best interest to convince everyone that it is not true so that we can start using all these resources to benefit humanity rather than trying to project a message that isn't true?
Yeah, live your life, Eric.
Well, yeah, that's what I would do.
That came up years ago when I was at the Metroplex Atheist Fellowship, and that same argument came up. We were all talking, and the president of that time, Randy Word, said, "No, if Christians realized that Christianity wasn't true and became atheists, they wouldn't spend that money on good things. They'd just buy beer with it." And so the big question is, does it really help Christians to get them out of Christianity? Does it make the world a better place, a worse place? Is it neutral? And that might be a good book club discussion sometimes. How better off would the world be without Christianity? So, but that goes back to the question that Eric is presented with, and that is, would you want to spend your life when at the end of the day you talk them out of Christianity, but then when they died, they're just as dead and don't exist just like you? What's been accomplished?
Yeah, and to answer your question, yes, Kelly, yes, if Christianity were not true, then yes, all this was a waste of time. Especially when, you have prosperity preachers who are scamming people. I would say that's a very small percentage of, I would say, legitimate Christians who are devoting their life and time not making anything, including going back to the church in Asia, the persecuted church, the underground church over there. Yes, it would all be a waste of time. And so if Christianity were not true, it goes back to, and if we just say, like Richard asked me, if atheism is true, then yes, I would say all of this is a waste of time. And I wouldn't want to waste my time arguing with people who, as to reiterate what James said, what I mentioned earlier, at the end of the day, we're going to the same place, if you will. So yeah, I wouldn't see the point in doing that.
I had a question for you, Eric. A regular topic that seems to come up at least every other month or every 3 months in the book club is a discussion about some variation of the problem of evil. If God is good and all powerful, why does evil exist? Why do bad things happen? But in chapter 21, it's interesting. I noticed that you played the Uno reverse card on that argument, and you actually made a case that the very existence of evil could be seen as actual evidence for God. For those of us who didn't get a chance to read the whole chapter or get to that chapter, can you kind of summarize that argument for us?
Yes. So in a nutshell, I would say that if and this will apply to the way I lay down in the book is, some atheists, as you said, will say God cannot exist because of evil exists. But in order for evil to exist, you have to make at least two assumptions, I would say. One would be that there is an objective standard of goodness. And then I appeal back to the moral argument that I made in the previous chapter, but again, just to be brief so anyone can push back or ask questions on it. If you go with the moral argument, if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties did not exist. Evil exists. Well, then that can only exist if there are objective moral values and duties. Therefore, it goes back to the same conclusion: God exists. So the way I put it is, if I say someone is lying, if I'm accusing someone of lying, then I am insinuating that there is a truth from which they are deviating. So a lie can only exist if and only if there is first a truth from which it deviates. In the same way, I argue in the book that if evil exists, it too would be a deviation and deprivation of the good. And then go on to, again, pointing back to the moral argument that there can only be an objective standard of goodness if God exists. That's the short version. The second assumption would have to be something like teleology to life in the natural world. Teleology is essentially the notion of a final cause, an objective purpose, goal. So, and then that would also imply a design, and then a design plan and a designer. So, to give you the example that I give in the book, if I said I had a bad phone, if I said this phone was bad, I am implying that there is something my phone ought to be doing, but it is not. And the notion of ought is also a teleological notion. It aims to a goal. So if I say my phone is a bad phone, then I'm assuming that it is dysfunctional, but a dysfunction presupposes a proper function. So there is a way my phone ought to be functioning, and a proper function assumes that there is a design plan to the way the phone ought to operate, and a design plan assumes a designer. In the same way, take an objection from a non-believer who would say, well, if God exists, why is there fatal diseases in children? Well, a disease is by definition a disorder of structure or function. And once again, you run the same line of logic. A dysfunction assumes proper function. Proper function assumes an objective design plan to life in the natural world. And a design plan would assume a designer. Hence, if evil exists, it can only exist if God exists, either by assuming that is a deviation from an objective moral standard, or two, that it is deviating from the teleology and design plan to life in the natural world. So if someone objects by way of evil, then I say, well, wait a minute, are you still an atheist? Because if evil exists, it can only be exist if something like God exists. But if you don't believe God exists, then in what sense can you call this evil? That would be the nutshell version.
Yeah, the pushback I would hear on that most often, Eric, is that you don't have to believe in God to believe in that there is to be able to recognize good and evil, and that you can ground it in evolution, that human flourishing benefits with kindness and that kind of thing. And so it's an evolutionary thing. It doesn't mean that there has to be a God. So can you kind of redirect that a little bit for us?
Yes, gladly. So I think that might be in my chapter on morality. Ian, you're right. That is often the pushback. And what's unfortunate is that pushback is based on a very big misunderstanding of what the argument for morality aims to do. So the argument for morality is an ontological argument. There has to be a grounding for which there is objective morality. And that's different than what's called epistemology, the knowledge of morality. So here's an example which I got from Coco that I have in the book. Say someone says, I don't need to believe in authors in order to be able to read this book and know the contents of the book. And I would say yes and amen. You don't have to believe an author exists in order to have knowledge of the contents of the book. But note, one, the author's existence is ontological, and knowledge of the content of the book is epistemic. So in other words, when people push back, they're confusing moral ontology, the existence of morality, with moral epistemology, knowledge of morality. The argument for morality is not you have to believe in God to know right from wrong, but rather that if there is no God, there is ontologically no right or wrong to begin with. Or imagine someone saying, they come to your house and they're like, hey, do you have any bread? And you say, nope, sorry, I'm all out of bread. And they say, well, that's fine. Can I just have a slice of toast instead? Well, if there's no bread, there can be no toast. And so to say I can, quote unquote, know morality without God, again, that's not the argument. And on top of that, if there is no God, there would be no morality objectively to begin with.
So could I jump in here for a second?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so I often hear this pushback on the argument from evil. First off, I never use the word evil when I consider the problem of suffering, just because evil is a morally loaded term. I think the argument, if it works at all, against the existence of a omnibenevolent and omnipotent God, if it works at all, it works internally to the Christian system. I could admit that I have no basis as a non-believer for distinguishing between good and evil. I can grant that fully, but internally, Christianity makes some claims about the nature of God and his love and so forth. And scripturally, I know that the Psalms aren't always necessarily to be taken literally, but there's a strong suggestion that, for example, like in Psalm 145, it says, the Lord upholds all those who fall and lifts up all who are bowed down. The eyes of all look to you, and you give them their food at their proper time. You open your hand and satisfy the desires of every living thing. I guess that means both people and animals. The Lord is righteous in all his ways and loving toward all he has made. The Lord is near to all who call on him, to all who call on him in truth. He fulfills the desires of those who fear him. He hears their cry and saves them. The Lord watches over all who love him, but all the wicked he will destroy. So these are claims that are made internally to Christianity. An atheist doesn't have to justify his or her position vis-a-vis evil or goodness. And the world is not like the psalm that I just read described. I mean, there's countless Christians who call out to God and who are destroyed despite having called out to God, and who suffer greatly. Not to mention all the animals that existed even before the fall, for example. Most of the suffering that's happened on this earth has happened before the advent of humans even came to exist. Those are the type.
Can I jump in here?
Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So quite a few things there. As you mentioned, the Psalms, not always be taken literally, and then you have generalizations in Psalms, even in Proverbs, that they would not have taken that way. But on top of that, you look at Scripture holistically, and even before getting to Scripture, as you mentioned, at best, it's very. What I appreciate about you, Ken, is that you're a sharp thinker, and I've always appreciated that. So I like that you say you don't use the word evil. Suffering itself can be loaded, but that's another discussion itself. But going back to at best, let's take the Stillman version of that. At best, that would pose a problem perhaps for biblical inerrancy. I don't think it would pose a problem for Christianity, given that you have 66 books instead of just one verse. And it definitely would not pose a problem to the existence of God, God himself. Then setting that that aside, even then, when you look at Scripture, you see Jesus talking about himself, talking about the tower that fell. And he says, do you think it fell on them because they were more wicked than you, or something like that? And the answer is no. It rains on the just and unjust. So there is never this promise that this prosperity preaching kind of gospel in Scripture. In fact, Jesus said, the world's going to hate you because they hated me. Also talks about being martyrs, that you're going to suffer persecution. You look at Paul's life, and that certainly wasn't the case. He certainly didn't have all those things you're mentioning. Then you talked about there are Christians today who call on the name of God and are destroyed. Well, but note, if we're going to do an internal critique, then on the Christian worldview, they're not quote unquote destroyed; they still exist. As I've heard an apologist, I think it was Frank Turek, once put it, they're not ceasing to exist or changing locations. So it's sure there is some harm done to them on this side of heaven, if you will. But if heaven exists, and it is, if you look at even in the NDEs, not to open up another can of worms, but my goodness, the research that has been done on that is incredible. The reports are incredible. Then my goodness, I can't wait to go there. So you see Paul say, I'll sum it up by saying, here's what Paul says: to live is Christ, to die is gain. So even in Scripture where Jesus says, don't fear the one who can destroy the body, but body and soul. And the mentality of the early church fathers was simply this: what's the worst they can do to us? The worst they can do to us is kill us, torture us and kill us. That's it.
Yeah, I think there was a definite shift in the biblical canon on the question of suffering. From the Deuteronomical view was that good works are rewarded by God's blessings, and vice versa. But that became untenable after the exile, when the Israelites had ostensibly followed God in every way they knew how, and yet still the temples destroyed.
You're saying the Israelites followed God in every way they knew how?
Well, following the temples, following the 586 BC, the Israelites became more monotheistic and more faithful, and yet they still suffered. And then arose the prophets that told it, and there was a shift, especially with the apocalyptic view, and after the Maccabean revolt and so forth. And so by the New Testament period, the whole view of suffering had shifted compared to. These are not my thoughts. These are not my ideas. I mean, Bart Ehrman has elucidated all these as well, and credibly, that if you read Deuteronomy 28, for example, all the blessings in the land and the curses in the land, that's a prosperity gospel, pure and simple, that you don't find in the New Testament. So there was a shift.
So now I would strongly disagree. On top of that, if you have Job, which was supposed to be written incredibly early, my goodness,
no,
you have a guy.
I don't think most critical scholars believe that was written early. It was written late.
So you have something like Job, which they would have had,
Mm-hmm.
and I haven't looked deeply into the time that it was written, but you have some of the earliest books itself talking about someone doing good and yet going through suffering. On top of that, you look at after the fall, thorns, thistles, however one wants to interpret that, whatever view of any age of the earth or anything one wants to see, it's clear across the board that what you have here is God saying there will be now sweat, suffering, labor. So yeah, I don't birth pains. So I don't see how that can be viewed as a prosperity gospel from the get-go. I don't know of any. In fact, I don't know if I think Quincy left. I'd love to hear what his thoughts are on, if there was any of that early on in Judaism, because I would highly, highly doubt that.
One of the big things was the existence of the afterlife. That wasn't even really. I mean, there was Sheol, yes, but there was not a clear heaven and hell until the time of the intertestamental period. But we're quibbling on details. The larger point I was trying to make was that I think it just doesn't work when I hear criticisms like yours about atheists appealing to the existence of evil and they don't have a standard by which to judge evil. The larger point is that internally there are. If the word love and God,
but that's not my argument that they don't have a standard. Again, you can know an objective standard because it's not an epistemic
they don't
argument.
have a basis. They don't have a basis for a standard. So
I'm not even saying that. What I'm saying is, if there is no God, no one would have any objective standard. Not just atheists. I'm just saying, if there is no God, there would be no objective basis. There would be lies can exist if truth exists, but if there is no truth, there can be no lies. So I'm not saying only Christians can't tell lies, if to try to make this analogous, but I'm saying there would be no lies at all because there would be no truth from which this thing is deviating.
Eric, is God subject to his own nature?
What do you mean?
I mean, is God, can he violate his own nature?
Can you give me an example?
Well, the most often used one is, can God make a rock so big he cannot lift? And the response is usually, well, no, he can't violate his own nature.
Yeah, I would say the reason he can't do that is because it's a logical contradiction in terms. But if you're asking, can God do something without his nature, I don't think anything can do anything without it beyond its nature.
Okay, then he's subject to his own nature, then, isn't he?
I wouldn't say subject, because that's what I'm asking. What do you mean by subject?
He has to act in accordance with his nature. He's not, I hate to use the word permitted, but that's the best word I can come up with at the moment. But he's unable to act in violation of his own nature. He's subject to those. So
I'm fine with that last way you put it. He's unable to act contrary to his nature.
Mm-hmm.
I'm good with that phrasing.
Okay, well, that would make him subject. And so any rules that he make would not be objective because he constantly is subject.
Subject
he
assumes
is a subject.
So no, I'm saying he's not subject to his nature. If in the way you're saying it makes it sound as if, and correct me if I'm wrong here, makes it sound as if he has to be in some sense like obedient or somehow, I don't know, as if he has an option even to do something outside of his nature, but he's choosing not to. I would say it's a logical impossibility for God to do something outside his nature.
Okay, but isn't God a subject?
Yes.
Okay, so then any rule that he makes is subjective because he is a subject.
No. So any rule that he makes is going to come from his nature. His nature is the object, although he is a subject. So if I said, I believe 2 + 2 = 4, does that make it subjective? No. Is a subject reporting it? Yes.
But you didn't make 2 + 2 before. You just simply said it.
Well, God didn't either.
Okay, so the objective morality, God did not make that it already existed outside of God?
Why would you say that?
Well, because the example you used is 2 + 2 is 4, and I said, well, you didn't make that, and you said God didn't either. So if God didn't create morality, then it obviously it must stand apart from him.
Or it can be grounded in his nature, the object, and he as a subject reports.
So God's nature makes morality, not God himself?
Grounds. So you keep using the word makes. I've never argued God makes morality. I'm talking ontology, the grounding for which it can even exist in the first place.
Well, speaking of God's nature, I'm sure you're familiar with Saul, where the guy comes to him and says, hey, did you kill the women, the children, the sheep, the camels? And the prophet goes, well, I didn't kill every, and he hears bah, bah, and he goes, this is God, did I just hear a sheep? And he goes, look, I did keep a few of the animals, a few of the sheep to sacrifice to you, God. And he goes, look, I told you to kill everything. Now you go and kill. Do you see what a horrible nature? It was so bad that Marcion totally rejected the God of the Old Testament. In our first canon, the Marcion canon just has, Luke and some letters. Do you see what a horrible God we have in the Old Testament? And then it's the same nature of Jesus.
Can you show me anywhere in my book or any apologist that uses the scripture in order to argue for the moral argument?
No. Okay. But another thing, you say,
so
why?
In other words, even if I grant that, which I don't, there'll be a whole other discussion. And as again, showing my cards here, this is what I call the lazy approach. When these are, I would dare say, if you allow me, Bill, these are red herrings, right? These have nothing to do with the argument, as it's the argument we're talking about. We're talking about if there is no God, there can be no basis for objective morality. Bringing up scripture has nothing to do with the argument itself. There are great responses to that. Copen has written, aside from his popular level book, which most people recommend, it's God of More Monster. He has more academic level books on that, so have other people. But all that to say, none of that would affect the argument, either the argument from morality or the argument I articulated from the existence of evil.
But double G.
I wanted to close the loop on just a point I was trying to make earlier, that if Christians believe that God is love, and the Psalms claim he is loving towards all he has made, I failed to see in the eons prior to human existence all of the animal suffering, the parasites, the predation, the starvation, the floods, the fires, all of that, how God's love is reflected, how the fact that he is loving toward all he has made is reflected in all of those events.
Are you assuming
that's an internal critique, has nothing to do with my ability to ground morality or not?
Are you assuming that if God existed and Christianity were true, there'd be no suffering?
No, I'm just making a
right.
I mean, I'm saying that this is an argument perhaps from ignorance, you might say, but I just fail to see a proper reason why that should have to be the case. If God is omnipotent, he can create. This is where the whole question of the age of the earth comes in, and it's more relevant than I think you're willing to admit.
I don't think it's relevant at all.
Sorry?
I don't think it's relevant at all.
Well, it's totally relevant.
It allows me to appeal to the eons of animal suffering prior to the existence of humans.
But let me reiterate, and this is what I think chapter 11 in my book, where I actually respond to a very similar thing you're asking. Mm-hmm. And it's essentially, if your answer is no, that you're not assuming that if Christianity is true, there'd be no suffering. And on top of that, if Christianity predicts suffering, if Christianity predicts horrible things happening, then I go back to what I said with Kelly. I don't see, it boggles my mind when non-believers bring up objections that are consistent and predicted by Christianity to say, well, how can Christianity be true if, and here's what I hear, here's what I implicitly hear. How can Christianity be true if the very thing it predicts and expects actually happens?
No, I mean,
that boggles my mind.
The Christian scriptures say he is loving toward all he has made. And that
right. And then we'd have to define what you think loving means. And also, if this is the only life, I see your point. If this is not the only life, I don't see the point.
Well, let's take people
out of this. Go to heaven, though?
I would say,
why I'm continually pushing back and saying animals. So
yes, I know. But one thing at a time. So one, I would say, going back to because there are assumptions on top of assumptions being made here. So that's why I say the first thing to address here would be, just to reiterate, Christianity, it cannot be an objection to Christianity by pointing to things that are both consistent and predicted by Christianity. On top of that, I don't think, rather given, okay, I'll speak for myself here. I would not say that if God exists and Christianity is true, then these animals wouldn't suffer, people wouldn't suffer. Now, the assumption I think that I heard both of you guys make was, well, do animals go to heaven? I think so. So, but if you assume that I believe they don't, well, then you may have a point at best, but I do.
Dogs do, but not cats.
That's true. That is a caveat there. No, so yeah, I definitely believe animals go to heaven. Great book is The Problem of Animal Pain and Suffering by Trent Doherty. Fantastic book on the problem of animal suffering.
So do
But
animals
yes,
have souls then?
absolutely. Why wouldn't they?
But
So
here's
are
the thing, Eric.
animals are born saved then?
Why would you say that?
Well, because you said they all go to heaven and they can't go to heaven unless they're saved.
Well, that assumes that the only thing that can go to heaven are things that are saved.
Oh, so things can go to heaven that are not saved.
Sure, trees can. There'll be trees in heaven. Whether that they'll be the same trees here or not, I don't know. But I don't think trees can even possibly be saved. But you'll have trees in heaven. You'll have grass in heaven. You'll have water in heaven.
By the way, Eric, the reason that this old Earth, young Earth is so important, we have the Institute for Creation Research here in Dallas, which all they care about, talk about is creation and evolution. If you have death and disease.
And I'm with you on that. That I wish they would stop focusing so much.
They're
on
obsessed with it.
Yes.
If you have death and disease before the fall, in Genesis, it says everything God saw and everything was good. We have fossils where we have cancer in dinosaurs. We have dinosaurs attacking each other. We have thorns.
Now, let me just for a second timer. You're familiar with a lot of old Earth creationists, correct?
Of course. Hugh Ross, I visited him personally.
Yes. And are you familiar with their responses to all that you're saying?
Yeah, but here's the thing. You have 40% of the population that believes the universe is 6,000 years old. Why do me and Gigi spend so much time on this? The reason is because that is just insanity. That if you're that
more power
ignorant,
to you. More power to you.
Yeah.
Thankfully, you're not talking
Well,
to
here's
someone
the
like
thing,
that. But
Eric,
what
you
I'm
have
saying is
answers
relevant to God's
you have
existence
answers
or
in
Christianity.
Genesis that just wasted $100 million building this stupid ark, which could have gone to feed homeless people. But if you look at Gotzi Gibbons' podcast, it's so simple. The heat problem, the mud problem, the heat problem just destroys global flood. So don't you think it's a good idea not to believe in myth and legend like the global flood, which is so easily disproved?
I think if it's a myth and legend, yes, we should not believe myth and legend.
Thank you.
And as I
okay, well, you're
right.
making progress.
Now, I'm not saying I believe those, in other words, as I said in my discussion with Kelly, I'm agnostic. I just haven't looked into these because I just don't care. So,
but
in other
here's
words,
the thing. In Genesis, Adam sinned and brought sin to all of us. In Romans and Corinthians, you have the last Adam, Jesus Christ. It has huge theological implications.
I would highly recommend going back to, what the responses Ross and other older creationists give. There's also Josh Swamidass wrote a very good book, and I haven't read all of it, just some excerpts, and I've heard him talk on it. I forget what he's an I don't know if I'd say expert in DNA. I don't know what
he's a geneticist. Yeah.
Geneticist. Yes.
Yeah.
He makes a really fascinating argument about how that would work. There have been lots of responses to it. So back to my point, it's not relevant to whether or not Christianity is true or God exists.
I would like to clarify one small thing, Eric, and you've mentioned a couple times, would we expect to see suffering if Christianity were true? And I would clarify that I would expect that if Christianity were true, we would not see unnecessary suffering. Because a benevolent God would not allow unnecessary suffering.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought, I don't know, but I'm glad you brought that up because that was my next point to Ken, was that at best, he can make an argument from gratuitous evil, but then we have to talk about whether or not there is gratuitous evil to begin with. On top of that, as I'm sure you know how the burden of proof works, if you're making a claim, then you bear the burden. Then I don't know how anyone could claim to be able to bear the burden of proof that something is indeed unnecessary or gratuitous evil. Because for that, you would have to.
I think it's easy.
You would have to almost. You would have to be almost omniscient to do that, and then if you're doing internal critique, which it sounds like you guys are doing, you're going to have to also consider the afterlife and soul building theodicies and Molinism and God's middle knowledge of how everything, the ripple effects that happens throughout time. So if you're going to do an eternal critique, then you have to consider every aspect of Christianity when it comes to what this would impact. And then you would have to bear the burden to show that something is indeed unnecessary suffering, because I don't know that the butterfly flapping its wings here won't cause a tsunami over here in X amount of time, or what they call the butterfly effect. I don't know how anyone would know that. So the only person who could make that kind of call would have to be an omniscient being, namely God.
I just think that what you're asking us to believe is that God, the God who ostensibly gave us brains to think and to consider the reality of the world that we live in, and then I apply my mind to look back into the eons prior to the existence of humans, and I see all the suffering that existed. And if I know that God, being omnipotent, could have created creation in one fell swoop and nixed the whole prologue of suffering over all those eons.
What makes you think
If
he
I
could have?
can't, if my mind that he
What makes you think he could have? Why do you have that assumption?
if he's omnipotent.
Right, but okay, define that for me. This is also something I talk in the book.
Able to do anything logically possible.
Right.
Right.
And in my book on this, we talk about there's a few things. One, now at this point, now we're doing divine psychology. If God exists, he should do A, B, or C. I don't know how.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, even then, why do he could? What would at what cost? What would that look like? Could God create? Let me put it this way. I would argue God could not create, quote unquote, any world, just any world. It not just has to be a logically possible world. It'd have to be a feasible world. And if you're granting libertarian freedom to creatures, then you're factoring in their free will decisions. And then at that point, it's not up to God what I do. It's up to God what world I exist in, but not up to God what I do. And if there is free will, and then you have people inflicting pain and suffering, and again, I talk more about this. I think
you keep bringing up people, but I keep wanting to sweep that away and say we're talking about before people even existed.
So then I would go back to the whole responses of what old Earth people give. If God is omniscient, then he doesn't have to wait till something happens to know it would happen. Then we get into interpretations of Genesis, which I don't want to get into. But if you have old Earthers who will claim that the garden was the paradise, not everything outside of it. But again, talk to those old Earthers. As I've repeatedly said, I don't take a position. I don't care. But no, you have, regardless of what you have, if you have an omniscient God who knows the end from the beginning before it even happens and can put things into place prior to that, knowing what will happen, I don't see an inconsistency. I don't see an objection. And again, this would have to assume that God promised that this was, quote unquote, heaven to begin with, which again, I don't, it's clear in scripture that it's not.
Well, I mean, I guess the point is, just to close what the whole point is that my mind, which God has sensibly designed, is unable to even conceive of any possible reason for that prologue of immense suffering. But if you can offer something, then
that's a loaded. Well, it's not that I need to offer something. I don't hear an objection. I don't, and allow me to oversimplify for the sake of the point. I hear I don't like this, and God should not have done it this way.
Well, I hear this. God claims to be a loving God and loving toward all he has made.
Then we go back to the definition of loving. And then again, if we only focus on this life, you might have a point. But if there is an afterlife for both animals and humans, then I think the sting, if you will, is much less before we even get into the arguments for afterlife.
I'd be interested in that book, what was the name of that book again?
The Problem of Animal Suffering, or The Problem of Animal Pain and Suffering by Trent Doherty. And then also saying, that God would want this or that. If God is, I would dare say that it was not logically feasible for God to create a world without this. And if it was, it would have been a world with, let's say, one person or one animal altogether. But
Eric, I think you've painted yourself into a horrendous position.
Excuse me, guys. Yeah, can I say something to Ken? About because Greta, you've popped in several times. If you don't mind.
No, please go ahead.
Thank you. If there hadn't been a whole lot of animal death before humans came on the scene, we would not be able to have limestone and all the things that made civilization, where we would have the technology to be able to spread the gospel to the entire world. So I think that it is loving to have, is it better for an animal to never have taken a breath and that at some point they may suffer and die? Is it better to have never lived and die to avoid suffering?
I mean, some animals suffer greatly and some don't. Some are more fortunate than others. It seems to be.
But is it better to have never lived, never to have taken a breath?
I mean, for some animals, yes.
Like what? I even, if we didn't eat cows and drink dairy milk, we wouldn't even have cows around. So, you don't think cows enjoy their life while they're alive?
I think we give them probably a better life than some do in nature. But I mean, these are all. I mean, I don't know what to say. Some animals suffer more horrendously than others. And the
yeah, I think Eric, let me see if I can restate the question a little bit here. Ken, I mean, I know I agree with what you're saying. Just because Ken can't imagine or can't come up with a theory of why there's this horrendous suffering in animals, because he doesn't know the reason, doesn't mean there is no reason. I think Ken would agree with that too. But it would be nice, if possible, for us to come up with some possible explanations for the evil. Not that you could know that that's the reason, but some possible beneficial reasons for the suffering, I think, would go a long way. Is that fair to say it that way, Ken?
Yeah, and focusing not on humans, but animals prior to the fall, for example.
Yeah, and I would say most of what would apply to humans, this is what Doherty argues, most of what would apply to humans would apply to animals as well. And I highly recommend checking out that book. But my overall point has been thus far has been that this is not an objection to God or Christianity. And as I oversimplified admittedly earlier, this exists and I don't like it, and God shouldn't allow it. Well, I need more than preference. I need more than this is distasteful to me. And I need to know why this would be an objection to God's existence or Christianity, because so far I haven't heard one. So in other words, I want to make clear that as far as I see it, there is no objection to response to begin with. Now, if it's phrased in the way James is saying, now what could be the reasons? Well, there's many ways to go about that to even answer that. One could be skeptical theism, where some theists say, I don't know, but that doesn't mean there is no reason. And if God is A, B, and C and has these attributes, then there is a reason even if I don't know it. Then you get into like soul-building theodicies. Basically, you're asking for theodicies. What I like what Plantinga points out in his written work is that there is no one. It's not an objection, and there's a difference between a defense and an objection, or rather, theodicy. The defense could simply be what I've tried to at least present, is that it's not an objection. So that's the defense saying, well, this is an objection. On top of that, now the theodicies, there's I don't know how many, but again, soul building theodicies, greater good. I mean, you've heard, I'm sure, C.S. Lewis, he takes his kids to the dentist, even though that includes pain and suffering and shots. Well, yeah, it's for a greater good. I also talk about that, maybe chapter 18. Well, yeah, but it's for a greater good. But to reiterate something that James was saying, just because we don't know the reason, and Phil said in the comments, doesn't mean that there is not a reason. And so it seems to be a divine psychologizing, thinking, here's how God should have done it, and then speaking as a finite creature with not having the attribute of omniscience and everything else that goes with who God is. But yeah, I'm sorry. So soul building theodicies, greater good, the ripple effect, if you will, that comes from that. And you see this in Scripture, which you meant for evil, God meant for good. So I think there are lots of things that go into it when it comes to the reasons God has for allowing. But I'm even fine saying, yeah, but skeptical theists are saying, I'm comfortable with saying I don't know, but that doesn't mean there isn't a reason.
Okay, Eric, I think we beat this stuff. Let's go to the New Testament. In your book, we have a lawyer here, so I'm just dying to ask her opinion. You state about in 1 Corinthians, Paul says that Jesus was witnessed by 500 people, some of whom are alive today. That's great. But do you understand? Here's the whole gist of the matter. We do not have good evidence. That's just Paul saying, we would love to depose these witnesses. We would love to see, when did you see Jesus? What was he wearing? Double G, help me here.
Well, okay. First of all, this was a creed. This wasn't what Paul said. So, Paul was repeating a creed that other people were saying. And we have so little information about who these 500 alleged witnesses were and where this appearance allegedly occurred or when this appearance allegedly occurred. And so, yeah, I frequently hear Christians say, Jesus appeared to 500 people. If anyone wanted to know for sure if Jesus was alive, all they had to do was ask them. Ask who, where, when. That's not possible.
Well, I think the 500, the 1 Corinthians 15, in context, this is one of Gary's points that I think is solid, in the sense that most scholars that he surveys who don't accept the resurrection will put that creed in Jerusalem 3 years around the time, 3 years after the crucifixion. And even Bart Ehrman will acknowledge James as the brother of Jesus, now being a follower of his earthly brother, is very early. And the quality of the historicity of this creed, it's not just Paul saying something. This is a creed that came out of Jerusalem that would have been, the apostles would have been hard-pressed to make this up as though it didn't happen, pass it around Jerusalem in the shadow of the first century temple Judaism, and then pass it on to a gentleman who was persecuting Christians just 3 years before as the very same thing that Paul received from Jesus in Damascus. So the gold, if you want, the historical gold of 1 Corinthians 15 is that it's verifiable, trustworthy history, whether you accept the resurrection or not. This is as good as it gets with the ancient sources from the ancient world, in terms of what was passed on, who passed it on, and from where it was passed on. And so the apostolic authority in Jerusalem, coupled with the Apostle Paul and the living eyewitnesses at the time, would have made it very easy for the first century Jews and Pharisees and Sadducees authoritatively to stamp out Christianity. Because Paul is saying, the apostles are saying, there's people in and around Jerusalem that saw this. And they're saying this in the context of first century Judaism, temple Judaism, in and around Jerusalem. So the historical viability of this is what gives it the weight. It's not just Paul saying that there are 500 people.
Yeah, Bill
think
Cluck and I discussed that today on the phone, actually, and we talked about it previously as well. Yeah, sure, it would be nice to have the phone numbers and social security numbers of every one of those 500 witnesses and be able to depose them right now. But the issue is knowing how early this was. This was in a couple of years of the crucifixion. And he writes to them as if they knew the story, they knew the creed, they knew the people, and they're not going to write back to him, what 500 people? We've never heard this before. Who are you talking about? What country do they live in? He wrote it to them who were alive, contemporary people, and this was a story that they knew about, that they heard about, and that he invited them to go investigate themselves. And you don't write that letter to real people, contemporary people at that time, with them just being able to come back. What in the world are you talking about? We've never in our lives heard what you're talking about. So it's this is why, if it's a gospel account and you try to date the gospels real late, if it's written 40, 50, 60 years after the crucifixion, then you can argue, well, they don't know what's going on. They never asked their great grandfather what went on back then. But this is within just a couple of years of the crucifixion, and it was a story that everybody, both the writer Paul and the recipients, were very familiar with.
I understand that, but I want more evidence. Another example: the zombies in Matthew.
Can we stick back to the 500? I wanted to say something on that.
Sure, go ahead.
But also you do understand that, at least from my perspective, it sounds like, okay, you have that evidence, but I want more. That's understandable. On top of that, I think Kelly said, it wouldn't be possible to do this. Well, not now, of course, but I think the point that Daniel and James were well making was that
no, I was saying it wasn't possible then.
Well, then I would highly disagree. There would be no reason for him to. when you understand Paul and who he's writing to, and the care and time that he takes to write these letters, he would lose a lot of credibility to say something so flippantly that would not have been possible. He's putting his reputation on the line, his credibility on the line. There's no reason for him to say many are still alive, though some have fallen asleep, unless he's implying that these people are available and willing to be questioned. And he's writing to people who you wouldn't have to explain who these people are. They would have known who these people are. He's writing in a time and place when it happened, where it happened. So I think removing yourself from the time period in history, sure, it's easy to say it wouldn't have been possible then, but I think you're failing to realize what was at stake, who he was writing to, and where this happened at. Paul being
I think you're really stretching how well people in the ancient world knew each other. How would people who live in Corinth, Greece, know the people who live in Jerusalem?
Let me take a lazy approach and grant everything you're saying. Let's just pretend you're completely right. You still have Paul. You still have James. Two skeptics. Why did they convert? Even if we get rid of the 500, you still have a lot more data to deal with, which I don't even think you can get rid of the 500, given everything James, Daniel, and everything I said. But even if we put that aside, you still have, what do you do with Paul? What do you do with James? What do you do with these disciples who were cowering in fear, peeing their pants, running because their Messiah got arrested and crucified, and 3 days later are willing to be persecuted and die gruesome deaths?
I don't know that we know that.
That's the whole point. Yeah, that's what Christian apologists cram down our throat, and we do not know. Andrew died in Scotland. Thomas died in. That's legend.
So I would recommend looking at Sean McDowell's work. He's done a whole book on this, and on top of that, and again, another part of the laser approach. I will concede what you're saying, and yet it still doesn't affect anything I'm saying. If I say fine, let's say we don't know it, the very fact that we do know that they are publicly proclaiming this was the implicit point that they are willing to be persecuted for this, just as Paul was, just as they were, just as Paul persecuted them. By doing this publicly, you are putting your life on the line and at risk. So
I'll
at
grant
the very least,
Kelly, I'll grant you Paul and Peter.
Kelly, I'd ask you, Kelly, if you're saying it's impossible, or how did they know this, or you have a different view of this historical setting. My question to you would be, what is the chain of custody, if you will, of your historical sources that give you the background information that you're coming up with? I mean, you're saying all these things about the text, about what's possible, what's not possible, but what is the chain of custody of the historical documentation that you have that shows what you're talking about?
Yeah, that's exactly the problem. We don't have that.
But you're saying that you're making some claims that this is impossible. You're saying, how did people know this? How did the people in Corinthians know people in Jerusalem, and these kinds of things?
I didn't say it's impossible. I said I think Eric is going too far in saying that the people in Corinth would absolutely know who these people in Jerusalem are, and would be familiar with all of them, and would know who Paul is writing about. And I'm saying that's really a stretch to think that people in Corinth know the people in Jerusalem. They're not even in the same country.
Okay, gosh, Paul was bringing to them a creed. Are you familiar, Eric or Dan, with Dr. Kirk McGregor? Anyway, he says that the writing of the creed, the style of it, shows that it had to have been written within months of the crucifixion of Jesus.
Says that absolutely is not true. That's not necessarily true.
He said it could have been a decade later.
The stylistic. I wish I knew more about it, but have you ever heard?
Anyway, we do, and Bart Ehrman certainly knows. And here's another thing, Eric. Let me just cut to the chase.
I don't think Bart Ehrman is an expert on.
He's totally an expert. Totally an expert.
So anyway, Bill, you just believe what the experts say, Bill?
What else do I have to go on since the evidence is so flimsy? Eric, you know about the zombies coming in Matthew, going to the city, and then they just say, hey, look, I got to check out. Here's the question. I know
atheists call these zombies, but you mean the one
dead saints, whatever you want to call. Mike Licona,
resurrected.
Mike Licona, who you refer to in the book, has said this is legend. This is apocalyptic.
He doesn't call it legend. He calls it apocalyptic language, not legend.
Okay, do you believe that?
I don't know. I mean, that's on that point as well. But note,
Well, I
going
wanted
back to
to
my
know,
laser approach,
Eric,
since this is what this is
Eric,
about, I can grant whatever you want to say about that, and it doesn't affect my case. That's not part of my case. It's not part of my
Well,
argument.
what I'm saying,
So,
and also Mike Lacona says the splitting of the curtain, which has theological significance, that now we can enter the inner
and Bill, I know
sanctuary.
you've read my book. Which of any of those points are part of my case?
But what I'm saying is, when they start to fall, the pieces start to fall. Where do you
Pieces
start?
for what? Pieces for what case?
For the
What
resurrection. And we discussed when I first
is
saw
that
you
a
in your
case for the
office,
resurrection?
when you have the Galilee,
I'm gonna plug my light
Jerusalem,
back in real fast.
when one gospel, Matthew says he appeared in Galilee, the other gospel in Luke and Acts, he says stay in Jerusalem. This isn't, I'm okay with slight contradictions, but this is a major contradiction. Do you understand?
I think you had to step away for just a minute,
Okay.
Bill. But you and I have talked
contradiction
about
to
this
what?
as well. Go ahead,
It's a
Eric.
contract. You have the resurrected Christ, second person of the Trinity, who does he appear in Galilee or Jerusalem? When he appears to Galilee, some doubted. If they're doubting and they're right there,
let me go back to this.
How am I supposed to believe 2,000 years later?
Let me ask this question, which I've asked before. Where is that a part of my case for the resurrection?
I don't care if it's not your case. It's a significant. We're talking about the resurrection.
So at best, going back to my lazy approach, at best, let's say I grant you this. At best, this would affect inerrancy, but wouldn't affect reliability. It wouldn't affect the case for the resurrection. It would not affect the case that these.
If there's a murder that happens and somebody places it on one end of the country and another person places it on the other end of the country, then you have a witness credibility.
Do y'all believe the Titanic sank?
Yes.
Yeah, I read your.
Okay, some witnesses say it split in half, some say it didn't. So therefore, we cannot believe the Titanic sank.
Well, but you can't just paper over something that happened in Galilee versus Jerusalem. Those are opposite sides of the country.
Here's the point. One, it's a good thing to have accounts that seem to be conflicting. That actually adds to the credibility. I'm sure you guys are familiar with Jerry Warner's work. Former atheist, cold case detective, became a Christian, and he makes the great point that this actually adds credibility because as a detective, you don't want everybody to have the same verbatim story because it shows cooperation. When you have differences, that is a plus.
Well, but there's evidence that Luke deliberately changed Mark. He changes the narrative to make it a recollection of what Jesus had said prior to the resurrection, and you have to actually look at the text yourself to believe it.
So that goes into the genre. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Luke is deliberately changing the source material from Mark to deliberately place the first appearance in Jerusalem instead of Galilee, which is inspired by Mark and Matthew.
Let me change tactics here of my laser approach. Therefore what? Let me grant what you said. Therefore what?
Well, I think you can't really trust Luke, for example. You might be able to trust Mark. But
can you trust the aspects of Luke that are relevant to what the scholars agree upon? Most of the scholars agree upon.
Well, I don't know that here's my approach to it is that even if some of these minimal facts are true and some are, like we talked about, the empty tomb are disputed by some, but let's say that we get there and you were talking about people who would not die for something they know to be false. There are plenty of women who have come forward claiming rape. For example, E. Jean Carroll has claimed that
are they dying for this?
Trump raped them, but they have been received numerous death threats, very credible and strong and powerful death threats. Okay, so what happened? So a thought experiment. Let's say somebody does actually follow through with that. Does that prove that that person was correct in what they were alleging? I mean, if so, then there's no need for court of law. It's just okay. They received a death threat, and maybe somebody.
So what do you do? What do you do with not only death threats, but having no historical reason to believe they would make this up?
Yeah, I mean, I grant that there's whatever happened was unusual. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had the birth of Christianity if there hadn't been some germ that was
Amen.
just like, for example, a peasant like Muhammad, conquering half the world in his lifetime. That's appealed to by Muslims as, oh, that certainly couldn't have happened naturalistically. Something happened at the origin of Christianity that threw people off. I mean, it was unusual. Something happened that I grant that changed Peter's orientation, for example.
Peter, James, Paul, right? And here's another thing. I referenced Jerry Wonder Wallace in my book, and what he points out is a cold case homicide detective for many years. There are three main reasons people engage in crime or conspiracy: sex, money, power. Which of those three did the disciples or Paul receive?
Well, I mean, it could be power.
How so?
In the early church, I mean, any cult has power dynamics in it. It may not, even if you're.
So you mean the people who were being persecuted, killed, fed to lions for entertainment, beheaded, stoned, boiled alive, the people who were being run out of their homes, the people who were being made fun of, they made fun of Christianity as the religion for women, children, and eunuchs, the people who were accused of, because they called each other brother and sister, they said they were committing incest. They said they were cannibals because they were taking communion. So the very people who are being very much persecuted and all this stuff, you're calling that power.
Just like Mormons in the 1800s were persecuted and killed. So
yeah, and when you look into history, that's a whole other discussion.
I know. We know a lot more about
James can talk more about
Mormonism because it's close to our era, and we have modern journalism and so forth. So we know about some of the sordid details of their lives. And I'm not defending Mormonism by any stretch of imagination, but we don't have access to that level of access into the lives of Peter. He could have been a jerk. We don't know. I mean, he was, the Ananias and Sapphira incident. I mean, there's something going on there that, strikes me as a power play. But all we get to read is the history that the authors who wanted to make them look good provided to us.
No, that's not all we get to read. You get to read Tacitus, you get to read Josephus, you get to read Lucian, where they all talk about, and these are all three people who either did not like or were actively hostile to Christianity. I think chapter 23, maybe, in my book. But you have them saying things like, gosh, these people are so deceived. My goodness, these poor, sad souls. They're following this sage, making fun of Jesus. And they're so weird because, they have this contempt for death. They don't care about death. They don't care about their possessions. My goodness, they have been deceived by this charlatan. And everything they're telling us, no, it's not just from the Gospels. We have extra biblical sources and cases.
Right, but that's making my point, though. I mean, that they weren't necessarily the saints that we have been led to think that they are.
How does that make your point? Because my point was they're not getting power when they're eating together, selling other possessions, selling things, meeting and giving things away. I mean, and having no concern for death.
You can have a church bake sale and have power. There's power dynamics there.
Well, plus we don't have
culture that was persecuted.
We don't have any evidence that this was intended to be a crime. You're saying that Wallace said that these are the main reasons that people commit crime, but
crime or conspiracy.
The people weren't necessarily saying that they saw Jesus because they were trying to commit a crime. So their motivation would not be criminal motivation.
Crime or conspiracy. So what's being alluded to here?
Okay, but it doesn't necessarily need to be conspiracy either.
Then what so this is the title that is given to this naturalistic alternative explanation to the resurrection, chapter 24, maybe in my book, 25. This is what's called the conspiracy hypothesis. That
I realize that, but I see it without the conspiracy. I see it as a single person that is starting the whole thing.
And then you would have to give evidence for that, and I'd love to see it.
Watch Apologia's explanation of how Christianity began.
If your source is Apologia, I'd be very questionable at that. But
how about Granny? How about a source? I'm sorry, Eric. How about sources from the 1st or 2nd century, Granny? I think that's what Eric is asking for: is actual historical sources, not hypothetical scenarios like Apologia. That is what he does.
I'll grant you that's a hypothetical scenario.
Hypotheticals, and so what's missing from and this is Gary's second point in his 2nd volume that's coming out this fall: naturalistic objections. Hypotheses, whatever you want to say, have very few scholars in the liberal camp will take a hard position because there's no textual evidence or any alternative to the resurrection.
Does
But
there
people
have
will
to
say,
be
well,
always
people,
have to
well, let
do
me
with
finish,
offer
kid.
something that's
People will
possible?
say something happened without conceding the resurrection actually did happen. What's lacking in naturalistic explanation? What's abundant are historical hypotheses. What's lacking is actual textual evidence, the kind in which we have, the amount in which we have in the Gospels and the New Testament. There's no historical source material for
There's
any
no
kind of
onus-
support. Well, for any kind of support for naturalistic explanations for what the disciples and the early church people.
There's no onus on the non-believer to support what actually.
I'm not saying there's an onus on the non-believer, but if you're going to make a claim as a non-believer, then the onus is on you.
No,
So you can
do is show something is possible. You don't have to show.
No, that's not what we're talking about, Ken. We're talking about the possibilities are what skeptics do all the time. What's lacking is solid historical evidence to support those hypotheses.
But if those possibilities are not ruled out by something that we know in history happened, then you can't make.
It's an argument from silence. Possibilities are a dime a dozen.
You can't make the claim that it was not possible then.
But the burden of proof would be on you. If you make a claim something it maybe happen, burden of proof's on you. It's not our job to prove you wrong. It's your job to prove.
The burden of proof is on
right.
somebody who claims something that we've never witnessed in the history of humanity before.
No, so maybe chapter 3 of my book. Burden of proof is anyone who makes a claim, be it negative or positive, bears a burden to prove the claim they're making. If you're claiming that this could have happened, I want to see evidence. I can't just take assertions for it.
Yeah, I mean, that ignores the background probability of a given event. Like that matters. It's not just.
Yes, and if God exists, that you have to factor into the probability.
Right, and that's why you argue first towards God existence.
Yes, that's right.
But without God's existence, that I think that there's, it doesn't. The resurrection by itself can't do the heavy lifting of proving that a God exists.
I'm not necessarily claiming that it is, but yes, if there's no God, yeah, as I said earlier, we're just wasting our time at this point.
Yeah.
You're going to say something, James?
Oh, I was just going to say that maybe it functions similar to a theodicy in that you're not saying this is the reason. You're just trying to come up with a possibility of what may have happened.
Yeah.
But exactly. It's ad hoc. It's pretty much ad hoc. But in some cases, I think Christian theodicies can function in the same way.
Good point.
I still need evidence for anything people claim.
There are things in Scripture that we can actually prove. Like when you're talking about Luke being unreliable, we can check the place names, the names of the leaders in the provinces. Were they there? How long it took to get from one place to another? The order of how he traveled. Those are things we can check. And Luke comes up 100% truthful.
It doesn't
actually he doesn't.
It doesn't mean he didn't twist what Mark had said.
Well, let me go back to what is the lazy approach. I think these are red herrings to discuss and talk about. I think we stick to the argument, stick what's being presented, and it's always bizarre to me when there are objections or comments coming from things that aren't even presented or argued for.
I'm sorry, I didn't read your book.
No. You're fine. I'm just saying in general, because even before you came on, that's what seemed to be the case. Is what about X, Y, and Z when I'm arguing A, B, and C?
Well, at this stage, I don't want to make this a more complex discussion than it already is, but I had a question for you, Eric, on chapter 15 on naturalism. First of all, thank you for providing that free chapter PDF for everybody that were not able to get the book. But you have a section on reductionism and physicalism. Can you briefly review that section, define those two things for us, but then also explain how an epistemic chain is involved in that? And again, that may be too complex in the amount of time that we have left, but I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, thank you. So to give the abridged and simplified version, essentially physicalism in the type that I'm talking about in the book would be something like strict physicalism. And essentially, and I know this wouldn't apply to all non-believers, and I also clarify this, but I would say it's most logically consistent. But let's say you have a non-believer who is a physicalist and believe that there is no soul and we're just purely physical. Well, if that is a logical entailment of, let's say, some base belief A, then there's two ways to attack epistemic chains. What are epistemic chains? If I believe all dogs are brown, let's call that the base belief. Then the implied belief will be that the next dog I encounter is brown. So you have A implies B. We now have the beginning of an epistemic chain. But if the next dog I encounter is not brown, then my implied belief was false, which meant that the base belief that implied it must be false as well. So you can attack a chain by, you don't have to attack the base belief, you can attack the implications of the belief, and that would suffice to show that the base belief was false. Same thing with, again, all dogs are brown, implied belief, next dog I encounter is brown, but if that next dog isn't brown, your base belief is false. So if, and there are non-believers, and I've countered them, I've debated them on my channel, you can see them, where they are philosophical naturalists, they're physicalists. Well, the problem there is that if everything is physical, then consciousness, if it exists, would have to be something physical, something that would have to be identical and reducible to something like the brain. But if I can show that the mind and brain aren't identical, and if this is if the epistemic chain is atheism, naturalism, physicalism, and physicalism implying consciousness is physical, well, if I can show consciousness is not physical, then you go back to destroying the chain, and therefore the base belief must be false. And I think it's trivially easy to show that consciousness is not physical. You take the states of my mind and the states of my brain, and given to the big long phrases, Leibniz's law of the indiscernibility of identicals. But for short, we'll say Leibniz's law. According to Leibniz's law, if A and B are the same, whatever is true of A must be true of B. They have to share the same properties, because we're not talking about two things, we're talking about one. Quick example, Eric Hernandez and the guest on this month's guest for the book club. Well, they're the same person. This month's guest and Eric Hernandez, same person. So whatever's true of one is true of the other. But if we could, even in principle, show something true of one that is not true of the other, or vice versa, it shows they're not the same thing. Again, this is trivially easy to do with consciousness and physicalism. Take a mental state like my thought or belief. That can be true or false, but no state of my brain can be true or false. And all we need is one example to show they're not the same thing. That's one. My brain can be in a state that weighs 3 pounds, but the thought I'm talking to you guys right now doesn't weigh 3 pounds. While we may be having heavy thoughts, in this conversation, we're not going to need to buy a neck brace when this is over. I'll be here all week. My brain can be.
Could you talk about the guitar versus guitarist? Yes.
So a typical objection, a popular level objection, which I think is so bizarre, is essentially that, well, no, consciousness is physical because, look, if you affect the brain, you affect the mind, you look at Alzheimer's, this part of the brain deteriorates, you lose your memory, and they assume that this is somehow proof consciousness is physical. That is so bizarre to me, because take to what you're saying, what I argue in the book is, suppose I had a guitar and I needed the top 2 strings and this string in order to play, let's say, the note C. And let's say those strings popped. I can no longer play the note C. But does it follow that therefore I am a guitar, or that the note C is identical to strings in a guitar? Does it follow that the notes are inside of the guitar, and if I broke it open, gave it a good shake, the note C would fall out? No. If I were playing music, and as I was playing, you begin to detune my guitar, it would affect the pitch and sound. But again, does it follow that therefore the note C is identical to the guitar or the strings or whatever? No. So at best, this shows a cause and effect or even dependence relation, but it does not establish identity, which, as I explained earlier, in philosophy, this means two things are literally the same thing. If two things are identical, it's literally the same thing. So none of this would show identity. At best, it shows cause and effect or dependence relationship between two things, but it wouldn't prove that there's no soul. So once again, if this is the epistemic chain, and an implication in this chain is that consciousness is physical, and we know it's not, we can show it's not, when therefore that base belief must have been false, such as philosophical naturalism.
I think those are all interesting and good arguments. And by the way, Eric, I want to commend you for a well-written book, very articulate, very easy to read. And it gives a lot of food for thought. One thing that sprung to mind when I was reading that section was I remember last year reading about a story about something that ChatGPT did that was unexpected. That, for example, it was given instructions to try to get some sort of password or some sort of breakthrough to some other, I don't know, to figure something out. In order to do that, though, it needed to read a CAPTCHA, one of those things you're challenged with, you have to read. And so what it did, and there was some prompting involved, but it reached out to a TaskRabbit, a human, it hired somebody online to read a CAPTCHA for the Chat GPT character, and the person on the other end pushed back and said, "Are you a robot?" LOL. And the Chat GPT responded and said, "No, I have poor eyesight. I can't read very well." And so, it made this up, right? So, and you were saying that and as a result, it was able to get the CAPTCHA that it needed to go to the next step of the gauntlet that it was trying to get through. But you made the claim that if there a falsehood, a human mind can have falsehood, something true or something false in it, but where does that live? That's not part of the brain. So where does this deception live in this AI? So I guess what I'm trying to do is a mirror image and challenge you to answer in the reverse, like where does that reside? If this is just a physical thing and it doesn't have a soul, where does that deception live?
Great question. Beautiful question. So I don't go that in depth in the book on the soul because that is a whole other conversation itself. Though I would say one of my areas of my bread and butter topic, if you will, is the soul. In fact, in another book, I contributed a chapter to a festschrift written in honor of Frank Turek, and I wrote my chapter, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be a Physicalist. And I may mention, I can't remember, there are two things. One, the Chinese room argument. Are you familiar with that?
Sorry, the which?
The Chinese room argument.
Yeah, I read about it back in the day. It's been a while.
Yeah. So John Searle, atheist philosopher of mine, he gives a great refutation to that, or rebuttal to that. But that basically, imitating consciousness doesn't mean something's conscious. The short version is
I'm not making the claim that it's conscious.
No, I know. I'm just
the question, where does that?
That's kind of
reside?
No. That's preliminary for those who aren't familiar with it. Say you have someone who doesn't speak Chinese, but he's stuck in this room, and he gets these papers with these squiggly lines, and he has a rule book that says when you get these squiggly lines, pass out this other set of squiggly lines. He can become so proficient that it looks to the outsiders that he's fluent in Chinese, even though he doesn't know Chinese. That's the preliminary remark to this. Okay, so I love the question. Now to say that there was I forget how you worded it, but basically we have to be careful with our language because in the way you worded it, you're applying intentionality to the AI, which I don't think would be there.
Where is the falsehood? I should say to be more less loaded.
Right. Here's how I can put it. If I were to write on this piece of paper, okay, what's today? Today's Thursday. If I wrote on this piece of paper, today is Friday, and I showed you the piece of paper and I said, where does the falsehood lie in this piece of paper? Well, it's not in the ink, right? It's not in the paper itself. It's not in the molecules. It's in my intentional state that I've conveyed onto paper. So what you have with AIs, you have something being designed to act a certain way, and it's just following the programming. So I wouldn't say the AI is lying, but rather that the designer has programmed the AI to be able to appear as if it is lying, much like John Searle's Chinese room, the person appears to know Chinese.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if something a little bit more is going on there. There was no programming explicitly to make that happen. It was a de novo. I mean, perhaps, yeah, it found patterns of other humans acting that way and aped them, perhaps. But it still raises questions about the nature that the line of reasoning that you're going through is like, well, there's something strange about even asking that question. And I don't know that physicalists would even claim that the brain is identical to the mind. I would say the mind
depends on which ones you talk to.
The mind is an epiphenomenon that arises from a physical brain.
So that would be a whole other discussion and problem, and that those would be what you would call weak physicalists. But that's a whole other discussion. I'll put it that way. But yeah, and I think epiphenomenalism also just causes more problems where you have someone like Jaegwon Kim, I think an atheist, definitely not a Christian, non-believer, who says, yeah, we don't want to go that route because epiphenomenalism is self-defeating, has no leg to stand on. And this is him telling his atheist colleagues we should stop appealing to epiphenomenalism. And then there's a whole bunch of problems with that. But all that to say, yeah, I wouldn't say that the AI is lying. I'm saying that there's something with the programming that can allow it to mimic, much like John Searle's Chinese room argument, mimic as if something's lying. But to the simple analogy I gave is if I put a lie on a piece of paper, you're not going to find the lie within the ink or the paper. It's coming from my intentional state that I've imposed onto something physical.
Let me, because our time is almost up, and on that line, I wanted to switch gears and talk to Phil for just a minute. Phil, do machines lie? Your book is Machines Don't Laugh, but do they lie?
No.
No.
There we go.
Is it just whatever's programmed in is going to come back out?
That's right.
Garbage in, garbage out?
To say that machines can lie, I asked the question in the book, if my computer displays the words "I love you" on the computer screen, does my computer love me? No, it's being programmed. Everything in AI is being programmed. There's nothing in AI that is original intelligence or an original idea. There's no conception of ideas in AI. AI is simply a massive, sophisticated synthesis of all of an enormous repository of knowledge about human civilization. That's what AI is. AI synthesizes an enormous amount of data, and then it can come up and it can simulate answers and can simulate various propositions and sentences but it doesn't know what it's simulating. It doesn't know what it's talking about. It's simply programmed to assimilate a vast amount of information and then organize it and regurgitate it back out again.
Let me say so much how much I appreciate you being here, Eric, and being on the firing line and defending your book. I still feel like that I just we just touched the tip of what was in there, but we did have some interesting conversations. Thank you for being a longtime member of the book club. Thank you for writing the book, and thank you for taking a couple of hours to share with us. So anyway, thanks so much. We'll look forward to seeing you guys next month.
Bye-bye. You're the man, Eric.